Welcome back to our study of 2 Samuel. This is session 6, and we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapters 8 through 10. And I just have to tell you, I just think this is a good story. And so I don't know if you've had time in the process of working through this study to just sit down and read through 2 Samuel as a whole. I hope you have, and I especially hope that before each of these sessions, you're taking the time to just sit down and read through the texts that we're covering, because no amount of talk about these stories can make up for the richness that is these stories themselves. And of course, I mean 2 Samuel as a whole, and also I love this particular story that encompasses chapters 8 through 10. It really is a series of victories. It's a season of success in David's life, a season of faithfulness, and it's designed as one section. Let's kind of talk through, paraphrasing some, reading some, and then of course seeing what we can learn. It begins with, in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. This is the first of many such reports, and so he defeats the Philistines, and then he defeats the Moabites, and then he defeats this particular king. Verse 3, defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Then you have some help from another king, and he defeats them. And the last part of verse 6 says, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. He from that point forward received some tribute. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. Then other kings are getting in on it. When Tu, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory. And then he also brought him articles of silver, gold, and bronze. And so you had these victory after victory after victory. And David's doing a good job. Says King David, verse 11, dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. Edom, Moab, Ammonites, Philistines, Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord, here we go again, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. And so this first real section is just a string of victories. And once you see David being victorious again and again and again, you get a bit of an update on the growing internal structure of his government. It says in verse 15, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. And David's sons also were priests. And so he's doing well. From this sort of quick succession of reports, you get a couple of longer stories in chapters 9 and chapters 10. Chapter 9 is about the interaction between David and Saul's descendant Mephibosheth. And then chapter 10 is about, David defeating an enemy who didn't take well to his kindness. I'd like to read chapter 9 because it's such a rich story, and then we'll paraphrase chapter 10. Also rich, but I think it will be okay with being paraphrased. Chapter 9, verse 1 says, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. And the king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He's lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. And Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-Debar. So King David had him brought from Lo-Debar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, and then we get his name. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, and at your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David told him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? And then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. Then he also tells Ziba, you and your sons come in and you can farm the land and take care of him because I'm going to take care of you as well. And Ziba says, your servant's going to do whatever the Lord commands. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. It's such a rich story. It's such a tender story of David reaching out to the son of Jonathan, grandson of Saul. It's followed by another attempt on David's part to show kindness, actually. There's a change in leadership over the Ammonites, and David had some positive experiences with Nahash, the previous king of the Ammonites. And so now that his son Hanun is going to rule, he actually sends a delegate to express his sympathy about Hanun's father Nahash passing. Well, whenever these men come from David to the king of the Ammonites, all of his advisors tell him, oh, David doesn't mean anything good for you. You cannot trust him at all. You need to show him that you are powerful. And so they really disrespect these men who were sent from David, and they disrespect David, and they disrespect the God of Israel. They actually do so in what seems to us a bit random ways, but you could understand in the ancient context. I mean, it wouldn't be pleasant in this one, but especially in the ancient context, it says that Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. In other words, they're just very publicly shaming them, and essentially they're making them look like half men. When the Ammonites, when David was told about this, he sent messengers to meet the men, for they were greatly humiliated. And David, he took proper care of them. He said, stay at Jericho till your beards have grown and then come back. And when the Ammonites realized that they'd become obnoxious to David, they actually go recruit some help from the Arameans, and both groups come together to make war. And so Joab goes out on behalf of David, and he recruits some of his soldiers. And essentially, Joab, who wasn't always the most devout person, says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have half of you fight over here, half of us fight this way, and whoever needs help is going to holler it out, and the Lord's going to do what's good. And the Lord did deliver Joab, and David showed up and fought along with his men, and they experienced some great measure of victory. Says the very end, verse 17, when David was told of all that has been happening, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. The Arameans formed their battle lines to meet David and fought against him, but they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobak, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. So that's the story, and as I said, there's no replacement for just sitting down and reading through the whole thing, but it's also fairly easy to see a couple of things. It's easy to see, if you're kind of paying attention to the details, that this really is designed to be one section. The battles that are actually mentioned at the beginning of chapter 8 are summarized at the end of chapter 10, and you also have the story bracketed by David's sort of round 1 and round 2 versus this Hadadezer character who continues to be a bit of a pain in the neck. And so you see this as one story, and you see it rightly as a story of victory, as a story of success. We could even say as a story of faithfulness. So what we're noticing here is that things are going really well. And honestly, there is much to learn, specifically from David's faithfulness. He handles himself well in this regard. If you look at some of how he's making his way through this period of his reign, you see that he gives God glory. He is victorious in all of these ways, but he doesn't take credit for himself, and he doesn't just pay it lip service. He actually takes all of these various articles and valuables, and he devotes them to the Lord, and he continues to give honor to the Lord. And so there is a sense in which he is appropriately leading the people by giving God glory. And speaking of leading the people, you also have, verse 15 says, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. And so he led all his people well. And there's a couple of things to notice here. One is the words just and right kind of sound a little bit religious to us, and that's probably fine, but they really are words that mean like justice and the ordering of society. And so this really is about his internal governing. And of course, any leader can find themselves tempted to favor some people, not others, the ones that they know, the ones that they're connected to, the ones that can offer them something back. And no, we have the report here that he did what was just and right for all people. He was an impartial king. He led justly. You also have this sense that, leaders can sometimes get so focused on outward expansion that they neglect what's going on right in the center. This can happen in churches, it can happen in homes, it can happen in businesses. And you see here that no, David was certainly expanding and being victorious, but even as he's victorious out there, he also is a wise and beneficial leader in here. The third thing that you notice, just in terms of learning from David's faithfulness, is that he showed kindness to his enemies. It may seem like Mephibosheth is not very much of a threat. I mean, after all, the guy's lame in both legs. What can he really do? But I think it is important to recognize in the ancient context the extent to which he did still represent a threat. I mean, he was the descendant of the house of Saul, the ones who opposed David. There could be very easy for an opportunist with a little bit of money and a little bit of ability to rise up and essentially to use Mephibosheth as a symbol to try to restore the honor of the kingdom that had been lost. And instead of destroying him, which is probably what Mephibosheth thought was going to happen when he was found out by David, no, he demonstrates kindness to him. And again, such a tender story of him taking care of this person whose body had been broken and could not really take proper care of himself. And then the fourth thing that we see is that he guarded Israel's honor. I'm thinking about the men who were dishonored by the Ammonite king. And also God, honestly. He guarded, by guarding the people's honor, he guarded God's honor. And so, again, a lot of wonderful things that you can draw from this, and you can recognize that there's some wisdom here. You may find yourself in a season of success, in a season of victory, and may your seasons of victory be seasons of faithfulness. And that's all fine and good. It's actually quite wonderful. But as is often the case with the scriptures, if you look a little deeper and look a little longer, you're going to find a little more. And you're going to recognize that this isn't just a moral tale to tell you how to be a good leader. As much as this story may be about David, this story is more than anything about God and God's faithfulness and the fact that God always follows through on the things that God says God is going to do. Maybe you noticed it. There's a couple of different points in here that you might have seen. One is God is fulfilling his promises to David. I'm talking about what happened just in the previous chapter. Think about some of the things God had said. God said in chapter 7, verse 9, he said, I'm going to give you a great name. And over here in chapter 8, verse 13, it says David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites. In verse 10, God says, I'm going to give you a place for my people Israel. And this is actually really cool. As a matter of fact, the way the battles are narrated seems to be pretty intentional. So the Philistines are actually west of where Jerusalem would have been located, and the Moabites are east of Jerusalem, and Hadadezer is up north near the Euphrates River, and down in verse 13, the Edomites are down south, and so it really is you're touching all 4 points of the compass. And the way in which this is reported is showing you that God is keeping his promise to David to establish this place for his people. And of course, you have the promise of rest from enemies. That's how chapter 7 began, and that's how chapter 7 ended. And that's also how chapter 10 ends, as the people of God have rest from their enemies. And so you certainly see God's faithfulness in his promises, his covenantal promises to David. But I also want you to notice, again, keep looking, you'll see more. And I think what we see in here, even beyond God's faithfulness to his promises to David, is God's faithfulness to his promises to Abraham. God specifically promised Abraham that the people of Israel would be given the land from Egypt to the Euphrates River. And here you have specifically mentioned the Euphrates River up in the north, and you have the Philistines who were in the scriptures associated with the Egyptians down in the far south. The promise that God gave to Abraham for a land for his people being fulfilled. The promise God gave to Abraham that his family would expand, I think, is manifested in this expansion of David's family. And we'll talk honestly about all of the problems that are raised by the way in which David establishes his family. But here what you see in this passage is that his sons were priests, meaning they were in some way following in his steps and living in service before the Lord. So you've got the promise of a land, you've got the promise of a family. And then also one of the things that stands out about God's promise to Abraham is that he very clearly said, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. This is precisely what you see in chapters 9 and chapters 10. In chapter 9, of course, you have the son of Jonathan who blessed David in a time of great need. And God is now blessing his descendants. But then you have this new king of the Ammonites who cursed God, cursed David, God's king, in a time when he should have done the opposite. And then you see God coming at him. And so I don't think that these are random stories. I think that we're supposed to see here that God is being faithful to what he just told David, and God is being faithful to what he had told Abraham. And of course, what the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel did not himself know, God, of course, knew that if you can trace God's faithfulness back to the beginning of the covenant, then you can certainly take it forward to the end. And I do think there is a sense in which we should read this story in precisely those terms. If we've seen that God has fulfilled the promises to David that we see, then the promise of sending a son who's going to rule on an eternal kingdom, yeah, we can probably count on that. If we can see that God is fulfilling his promises to Abraham to bring blessing and cursing to those who bless and curse him, then we see that this seed of Abraham, who will bring blessing to all the nations of the world, is actually going to come to fruition. That, I think, is some of what we see in this story. There's one more bit of gospel before we go. It is entirely appropriate when you read the scriptures to try to see where you fit, to try to identify in different ways with some of the various characters. It's a natural and appropriate thing to do when you're reading a story like this. And it is fine and good to learn from David. By all means, as we said before, in your seasons of victory, may they be seasons of faithfulness where you give God glory rather than taking undue credit for the things that he's provided, that you discharge all of your duties well, not just some of them, that you demonstrate kindness even to those who have mistreated you, and that you guard the honor of those over whom you have care. These are valuable lessons to learn. So it's fine to learn from David. But if you want to locate yourself in this section of the story, look harder. Land elsewhere. I don't know if you noticed. He was a member of Saul's household. Royal blood for sure, but a failed line. And they had become enemies of the one true king. He was lame in both legs, unable to worship God properly, and unable to do anything about it. He was exiled in a place called Lo-Debar. Don't know if you picked up on this, but probably would be tough to do so. Debar comes from the Hebrew word for word or thing or idea. Literally, Lo-Debar means no idea. Where is this guy? No idea. That's literally where he lives. And his name, Mephibosheth, is kind of hard to identify precisely what it means. Some scholars would say it means one who scatters shame. Others would say that it means something like from the mouth of shame. But what we know for sure is that it's associated with the word boshet, which means shame. Do you see? Do you see you and me in this story? We are members of the line of Adam and Eve. We have royal blood running through our veins, but it is a failed line whose head became an enemy of the one true king. We are lame in both legs, disqualified from the worship of God, and unable to make ourselves so qualified. We are lost in our lostness, and we are full of shame. Is this advice that we get in Samuel? No, this is news. Now, first you get the bad news. We are descendants of Saul. But then you get the good. God has sent his own son, a descendant of David, who, like his forefather, came to track us down, dust us off, bring us home, invite us to his table, and provide our every need. God's promise is true, and his faithfulness never ends. This is a good story. This is good news.